In the first episode of Juan March's biography, I explained his rise and how he became the richest man in Spain. I recommend you listen to it if you haven't already. But after World War I ended, the business of the millionaire smuggling king was in trouble due to economic changes and increased persecution by both the central government and the local authorities in Palma de Mallorca. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and today I will talk about a murder, the challenges Juan March faced between 1918 and 1924, and the lucrative deals he later struck with the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera. Juan March was a man with blood on his hands, especially from the Spanish Civil War, but he was also the intellectual author of a murder. March was said to marry Leonor Cervera, the daughter of a wealthy merchant who became one of his major business partners. But in 1916, Juan discovered that his wife had been unfaithful with Rafael Garau, son of the co-owner of the tobacco factory in Algiers I mentioned in the previous episode. Letters revealed that Leonor loved Rafael, but her feelings were not reciprocated. The handsome young man was a womanizer. Juan March was also a womanizer. Both before and after learning about the affair, he was repeatedly unfaithful to his wife. Many young mistresses regularly visited the family home, and from the late 1920s until his death, March maintained a relationship with a showgirl from Burriana named Mathilde Rech. So it wasn't that he was mad because he had been faithful and she had not. He was mad because he felt humiliated. At the time, both law and society only punished women for adultery, and for Spain's top smuggler, Leonor's infidelity posed a serious threat to his reputation. Rafael Garau was also trying to build his own client network, independent from March's, so with his murder, Juan could kill two birds with one stone. While in Valencia, at least two hitmen stabbed Garau 17 times to make sure he didn't survive. The Mallorcan boss followed the Italian mafia custom of paying for the funerals of those he had ordered killed. Corruption was on full display at the wake organized by March. Smugglers and high-ranking officials like the civil governor of Valencia, the mayor of Palma, and the president of the provincial council paid their respects to a smuggler. After the murder, the March family left Santa Margalida, which was also Garau's hometown, and moved to Palma. They settled in a palace where March carried out major renovations and set up the offices for his unregulated bank on the ground floor. 3 smugglers suspected of the murder were arrested, but released within days. No witnesses were willing to talk. Amid rumors pointing to Juan March, he voluntarily appeared before a judge in Valencia. When the Mallorcan asked the judge whether he needed evidence to prosecute him, the judge said yes, to which March confidently replied, quote, "Then my prosecution is going to be very difficult," end quote. While the Mallorcan press barely covered the case, 2 journalists from a national newspaper gave it wide exposure and even interviewed the judge. The judge hinted in his statements that high-profile arrests were coming. 2 days later, he was removed from the case by the Valencia Court of Appeals. Not suspicious at all. The 2 journalists traveled to Mallorca to investigate, but were met by 2 thugs who forced them into a car and strongly advised them to stop digging into Garau's murder. They left the island, and March paid the newspaper 30,000 pesetas to drop the story. Thanks to the Mallorcan capitalists' corrupt maneuvering, the case was handed off to multiple judges and prosecutors and eventually shelved without anyone being punished for the crime. Rafael Garau's father and brother publicly accused March of being behind the murder, and in 1917 dissolved their business partnership with him in Algeria. The resentful couple then fabricated charges accusing Garau's father and brother of being German spies, which led to their temporary pre-trial detention, until French authorities realized it was all a setup by March. In any case, rumors linking March to the murder would haunt him throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Let's set aside this fascinating criminal case and talk business, but before that I encourage you to subscribe and support me on Patreon if you haven't already. In 1920, March further diversified his income streams by entering the petroleum and chemical industries. He bought a property with access to Porto Bay, which at the time wasn't yet a neighborhood of Palma. There, using hundreds of workers, he built a factory, warehouse, and port in record time to load and unload petroleum and chemicals. The port had more capacity than any other in Mallorca, underscoring the ambition behind the project. The Porto plant produced chemical fertilizers to improve agricultural yields and refined petroleum imported from the newly formed Soviet Russia. Even before this, Mark had become the majority shareholder in a fertilizer company. Ultimately, his moves reflected a strategy to monopolize the entire value chain. Mark was the largest land seller, the supplier of agricultural chemicals, and the top buyer of agricultural products from the Balearic Islands for both Spanish and international trade. However, not everyone in power was pleased with these industrial ventures. The Porto refinery directly competed with the Shell distributor in Mallorca, which was owned by Manuel Salas, the island's wealthiest man before Mark rose to prominence. They also disapproved of Mark building a polluting factory in an area where upper-class families like Salas had summer homes. They lobbied the central government to shut it down, citing health concerns. Just days after the Porto plant opened, Mark's enemies succeeded in having it closed for several months by government order. Mark took his defense to the press, claiming his goal was to create wealth for workers in contrast to the idleness of the elite. He criticized the promotion of low-value sectors like tourism and leisure in Mallorca and was convinced that industrialization will bring much greater prosperity. At the time, no one could predict that Mallorca would one day become a tourist amusement park. Mark cloaked his economic interests in patriotism, a common tactic of ruling elites to mask their self-serving agendas, claiming that opposition to the factory was an attack on Mallorcan workers. The smuggler used the press and allied liberal and socialist politicians to defend his business. Socialists saw industrialization as a needed vehicle for socialism and modernity. For them, work came first and the environment second. Health damage was the price to pay for survival and employment. Though they acknowledged Mark's Machiavellian nature, they viewed him as the embodiment of the new entrepreneurial bourgeoisie, a modern alternative to the outdated nobility. After Antonio Maura's government fell in March 1922, Mark met with the new prime minister and promised to create a political faction in Mallorca that would support him in exchange for reopening the factory. To gain King Alfonso XIII's backing, Mark gifted him shares in the Transmediterranea Shipping Company. And just like that, the new government authorized the reopening of the Porto Petrochemical plant, on the condition that it stopped producing nitric acid and with the warning that periodic health inspections will follow. The problems Mark faced with the Porto matter were minor compared to the war the Spanish state declared on his smuggling empire. After the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Anual in Morocco, a coalition government was formed in August 1921 with Antonio Maura at the helm, an avowed enemy of Mark and also a native of Mallorca. The Catalan conservative and fellow millionaire Francesc Cambó joined the government as Minister of Finance and was determined to go after Spain's biggest smuggler in a bid to balance the national budget. Little did he know that during the Spanish Civil War, Cambó and Mark would end up on the same side, both financing the nationalist rebels. Mark's tobacco smuggling operation was so vast that it deprived the state of an estimated 20% to 30% of what it should have collected from official tobacco sales. In his memoirs, Cambó wrote, quote, "We waged war against smuggling. This wasn't the colorful, endemic smuggling that had long thrived along Spain's borders and found its most famous portrayal in the opera Carmen. This was technical, modern smuggling carried out by a man of exceptional talent who proudly called himself the last pirate of the Mediterranean, and whose reach posed a serious threat to customs revenue." End quote. The government and the Compañía Arrendataria de Tabacos worked hand in hand to combat smuggling. Inspector salaries were increased, faster ships were purchased to chase smugglers, and there was a sharp rise in police surveillance and tax audits targeting Juan March. Corrupt agents were expelled from the force. On the company side, the monopoly modernized its machinery to boost production and improved tobacco quality by importing raw materials from Turkey, the US, Cuba, and Algeria. By purchasing Algerian tobacco, the monopoly also secured greater cooperation from the French authorities in cracking down on smuggling. In Ceuta and Melilla, the company sold tobacco below cost to make March's business unsustainable. In military campaigns launched from these cities, Spanish soldiers carried the company's tobacco as a patriotic gesture, directly undermining March's monopoly in Morocco. Between 1921 and 1923, this government crackdown took a heavy toll on Marc's operations. Still, Marc found ways to adapt. He flipped the situation in Ceuta and Melilla to his advantage by buying up the underpriced tobacco and reselling it on the Spanish mainland using his shipping line, Transmediterranea, to pocket the profit margin from the price difference. The king of smuggling increased bribes to custom officers, ordered landings in more remote locations, changed smuggling routes, and enforced harsher penalties on informants. His strategy was to endure the pressure as best as he could while waiting for a change in government that might ease the crackdown. In short, between 1918 and 1923, Marc's business suffered due to the end of World War I, the Porto conflict, and the smuggling crackdown. Perhaps the political obstacles he faced in expanding his empire convinced him he needed to become a member of parliament to gain parliamentary immunity and greater political influence. In the 1923 elections, Marc led the Liberal Party in Mallorca, and through widespread vote buying and intimidation, defeated Antonio Maura, one of the most prominent politicians of the Bourbon Restoration era. The government formed after those elections didn't last long. In September 1923, General Miguel Primo de Rivera staged a coup d'etat, which King Alfonso XIII accepted. One of the pillars of the new regime's legitimacy was its campaign against political corruption, so it's no surprise that Juan March became a target to win over public opinion. Former finance minister Santiago Alba, deep in Marc's pocket, quickly fled to France. Primo de Rivera ordered the judiciary to scour records for any evidence that could be used to prosecute Marc, and demanded a hardline approach from custom officers. Corrupt officers would be fired and jailed. The investigation into the murder of Rafael Garau was reopened with the cooperation of his family, who also sought revenge for being imprisoned and nearly executed on false espionage charges during World War I. In April 1924, a judge issued a warrant for Marc's arrest, and the millionaire fled to France. The judge was threatened by Marc's henchmen and offered a 500,000 peseta bribe to drop the case. Outraged, the judge responded, quote, "Tell Mr. Marc that he still cannot control and manipulate all of the state's institutions," end quote. I love the noble spirit of this judge, but he was naive. The man who had orchestrated Rafael Garau's murder on the ground boasted that he knew all of the details, and for that reason he had to be silenced to prevent any chance of arrest and confession. The accomplice was fatally poisoned during a dinner. In Marc's mafia-like world, the code of silence was sacred. From Paris, Juan March used his network of contacts to initiate friendly relations with Primo de Rivera and convinced him it was better to have him as an ally. It didn't take long. By July, he was back in Palma inaugurating the Casa del Pueblo, which he had financed to improve his image among workers. The legal cases against Marc, for the murder of Rafael Garau and for smuggling, never advanced past the investigative stage. To ensure things stayed that way, Marc's henchmen stole and destroyed court evidence. Spain's war against Juan March ended with the capitalist victory. As a result of his collaboration with the new regime, Marc financed the magazine La Correspondencia Militar, which ironically focused on exposing corruption. He also financed the construction of a church in Tetuan, and at the dictator's request, purchased land in Tangier to be settled by Spaniards, and founded a tobacco factory. These were the costs of staying in the good graces of the military dictatorship. Between 1924 and 1929, Marc's empire expanded and consolidated. In 1926, he officially founded Banca Marc, though he had been engaging in financial activities since the beginning of his business career. He even tried to gain the support of other major capitalists and the Spanish political class to create a large agricultural bank that would replicate the Banca Marc model across Spain, aimed at accelerating the fragmentation of land ownership. Juan believed this would be the most important business venture of his life, but it never materialized. He also dove into the electricity industry. By merging local providers, he founded an electricity company that monopolized the market in Mallorca and another in the Canary Islands, later selling both for a hefty profit. Since World War I, Marc had maintained excellent relations with the German spy Wilhelm Canaris, who would later become the commander of the Weimar Navy and head of Nazi Germany's military intelligence service. During the 1920s, Marc collaborated with him on a secret German rearmament program aimed at building better submarines. Mark acquired minerals Germany was banned from purchasing for military purposes. With King Alfonso XIII's blessing, German engineers tested prototypes at the Valencia shipyards of Unión Naval de Levante, a company founded in 1924 with Mark's involvement. Mark understood that the politics of his time were driven by the masses and the crucial role the press played in shaping public opinion. In 1921, he founded El Día, a liberal newspaper aimed at the people of Mallorca. But more significantly, during this period, he acquired two nationally circulated newspapers printed in Madrid. One was La Libertad, which followed liberal ideals and published writings from Republicans and Socialists. The other was Informaciones, a conservative outlet that became the second most read newspaper in Spain, and in the 1930s served as the mouthpiece for the Nazis in Spain. By the 1920s, Juan March was so rich and powerful that many people came to him asking for favors: loans, government jobs, employment. One young woman came begging for him to save her brother, who had been sentenced to death. She made it clear she would do anything. Taking advantage of his position of power, Mark had sexual relations with her, and in return arranged for her brother's sentence to be commuted to exile. Such was the power of the man who had already become the richest man in Spain. In 1927, Mark sought the tobacco monopoly concession in Ceuta and Melilla to expand his tobacco empire and facilitate further smuggling to mainland Spain at the expense of the existing monopoly holder. To win favor with the monarchy, Mark followed Primo de Rivera's advice to be generous to the Queen. He paid for whatever jewelry she wanted in Paris, donated to the Cancer Institute, where she was honorary president, and even promised to build a hospital in Mallorca to treat tuberculosis patients. However, once the Second Republic was proclaimed, he halted construction, as there was no longer a queen to please. The ruthless Mallorcan tycoon didn't care in the slightest about helping the sick. Mark made a generous offer to obtain the tobacco monopoly. At first, Finance Minister José Calvo Sotelo wanted to strictly follow legal procedures and insisted on a public bidding process. But when Mark threatened to withdraw his offer, the Council of State granted him the monopoly for Ceuta and Melilla without a public tender. This effectively legalized Mark's illicit activities in Morocco and eliminated smuggling between the two cities and Morocco. If you can't beat your enemy, join him, and at least collect more taxes. Still, not everything went Mark's way under Primo de Rivera's dictatorship. In 1927, the dictator promoted the creation of a state-backed company supported by various Spanish banks that would hold a monopoly on oil sales in Spain. That company was CAMSA, created primarily to reduce Spain's dependence on foreign oil giants like Shell and Standard Oil. Mark had participated in the bidding process through his own company, Porto, since he was already active in the oil industry. However, after losing the bid, his Mallorca facilities were expropriated. Shell and Standard Oil responded to CAMSA's creation by restricting oil sales to Spain. These two companies controlled a large share of the global oil trade, putting the Spanish government in a tight spot. Porto had a contract to import oil from the Soviet Union, which at the time was Spain's only viable alternative to the Western oil giants. When negotiations over the expropriation amount stalled, Minister Calvo Sotelo decided to seize the facilities, citing the urgent need for Russian oil. This led to lawsuits and negotiations. In 1931, a French court ruled that CAMSA had to pay 7 million pesetas for the expropriation and 35 million for the loss of the exclusive Russian supply contract. These amounts were significantly less than what Mark had demanded as compensation. He never saw the payout as sufficient and even continued to complain and demand more during Franco's dictatorship. Not everything could go the way of the Mallorcan magnate. That concludes the second part of the series on the life of Juan March. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, comment on what stood out most, and please consider supporting the show at patreon.com/newhistoryspain in exchange for exclusive benefits. In the next episode, things are going to get very interesting as I discuss Juan March during the Second Spanish Republic and his key role in the Spanish Civil War as the financier and enabler of Franco's uprising. Follow me so you don't miss it, and see you next time!